In the great silent ocean between the stars, there is an illusion of peace. It is a vast, cold, and indifferent void punctuated by the gentle light of distant suns and the swirling, vibrant nebulae that birthed them. To the fledgling civilizations that huddle on their lonely worlds, this great dark is a frontier to be conquered, a mystery to be solved, a canvas upon which to paint their destinies. They build empires, they forge gods, they write symphonies to the light of their stars, all under the assumption that they are the primary actors on this cosmic stage. They are tragically, catastrophically wrong. The silence is a lie. It is not empty. Lurking in the unimaginable gulf that separates one galaxy from the next is a presence. It is not a fleet, nor an empire, nor a god in any sense that mortal minds could comprehend. It is something more primal, more absolute. It is a sentient void, a living hunger, a singular unified consciousness born from a trillion organisms, all bound to a single terrifying imperative to consume, to grow, to assimilate all that is into itself, until only it remains. This is the hive mind. This is the Tyranid. Do not make the mistake of assigning it malice. Hate is a complex, wasteful emotion born of ego and fear. The hive mind has no ego, and it knows no fear. It does not seek to conquer for glory or to enslave for power. Such concepts are as alien to it as the concept of mercy. It operates on a logic as pure and as relentless as gravity. A star does not hate the planet it holds in orbit. A black hole does not feel anger towards the light it devours. The Tyranid does not hate the life it extinguishes. It is simply hungry. It is an eternal, gnawing emptiness, a void that seeks only to be filled. And the universe is its feast. Every star system, every world teeming with life, every civilization that has ever risen and fallen, they are not seen as rivals or obstacles. They are resources. They are sustenance. The hive mind does not perceive the soaring spires of a hive city as a testament to architectural genius. It perceives them as harvestable minerals and refined metals. It does not register the sacred texts of a religion as the repository of a culture's soul. It registers them as processed cellulose. It does not see a warrior clad in ceramite standing defiant with a laser gun in hand as a hero. It sees only protein, calcium, and a collection of useful genetic data. All that you are, all that you have ever been, all that you ever will be, is reduced to a single cold utilitarian term: biomass. The love you feel for your family, the faith you hold in your emperor, the intricate tapestry of your history, the art that makes your heart ache. The knowledge passed down through 1,000 generations, all of it is irrelevant. It is noise. The only thing that matters is the raw biological material that constitutes your existence. You are not a person. You are a calorie. Your world is not a home. It is a meal. This great devourer drifts through the void, a silent, patient predator of galactic proportions. It has consumed galaxies whole, leaving behind nothing but cold, sterile rock, stripped of atmosphere, water, and life. Its approach is not heralded by declarations of war or the blare of trumpets. It begins as a shadow, a subtle wrongness on the edge of reality, a creeping silence in the psychic choir of the cosmos, a flicker of movement in the corner of an astropath's nightmare. It is the advancing front of a storm that will consume the sky, a tide that will drown the stars. The question then is not one of if you can win. The concept of victory is a mortal delusion in the face of such a force. The question is not one of survival, for survival implies a future. The true question is far simpler and far more terrifying. What happens when that patient cosmic hunger finally turns its gaze from the distant dying light of another galaxy and focuses with dreadful absolute finality upon the warm, bright, and living glow of your world? What happens when the Tyranids decide it is your turn to be harvested? The first caress of the devourer is not a claw but a silence. On the agri-world of Viridia Prime, a planet known for its endless fields of grain and its unwavering tithes to the Imperium, the astropathic choir was the first to feel the wrongness. For them, the Imperium had always been a roaring, chaotic ocean of psychic energy. It was a storm of a billion souls, a cacophony of prayer, rage, fear, and hope. To navigate it was to be deafened by it. But now, something was changing. A pressure was building at the edge of the system, a deep and pervasive quiet that was not peace, but an absence. It was like a soundproof wall being erected in the heart of the storm, swallowing the echoes of distant star systems, muffling the guiding light of the Astronomicon, until it seemed a faint, desperate candle in a suffocating fog. The astropaths began to suffer. Their chanted messages to neighboring systems became strained, warped, arriving as little more than static and whispers of terror. Their dreams became a shared landscape of horror. They dreamt of a great shadow shaped like a ravenous maw blotting out entire constellations. They saw stars not dying but being eaten. They felt a psychic weight so immense, so utterly alien that it threatened to crack their minds like glass. They reported their fears to the planetary governor, speaking of a shadow in the warp, a spiritual blight that was isolating Viridia Prime from the grace of the Emperor. Their warnings were noted, filed, and ultimately dismissed as the typical melancholia of their kind. The silence was coming and the world's ears were closed to it. While the Psykers felt the silence descending from the heavens, a different kind of faith was stirring in the shadows of the world below. Deep within the warrens of Hive Primus's underbelly, and in the isolated frontier settlements, where the Emperor's light was dim, the cult of the star-born saviors gathered in secret. To the downtrodden, the dispossessed, and the desperate, they offered a seductive promise: the gods were coming. Not the distant, demanding God Emperor on his golden throne, but true gods, living gods who would descend from the stars to deliver the faithful from their lives of toil. They did not know they were the vanguard of their own destruction. They were a living infection, a genetic time bomb worshipping the very doom they sought to call down. Their patriarch, a four-armed, monstrously beautiful creature they revered as an angel, was a genestealer, the first seed of the invasion. His kiss did not bring death, but a terrible rebirth, rewriting the genetic code of his followers, and their children, binding them in absolute biological loyalty to the hive mind they could not comprehend. Under the cloak of night, the disappearances began. A lone watchman on the hive wall, a troublesome ganger in the underslums, a family on a remote farmstead. They were not killed but taken into the cult's clutches to be given the blessing to have their bodies and minds subverted to the cause. The local enforcers noted the rise in missing persons, blaming it on gang wars or the harsh realities of frontier life. They were looking for criminals, for rebels. They could not conceive of looking for worshippers of the apocalypse. At the same time, the most subtle signs of the invasion began to appear in the natural world, noticed only by the data-obsessed acolytes of the Adeptus Mechanicus. In a biological research outpost on the planet's southern continent, Magos Biologis Hephaestus 7, a man more machine than flesh noted anomalies that defied all established patterns. Indigenous herd animals whose migratory routes had been unchanged for millennia suddenly stampeded in panicked, illogical directions, fleeing an unseen predator. Avian creatures fell silent, their songs replaced by an unnerving quiet in the forests. More disturbing were the new specimens. In the remote acidic jungles of the equatorial band, scouting servitors returned with samples of flora that did not exist in any imperial archive. It was a creeping, violet-hued vine that grew with unnatural speed, strangling native plant life and secreting complex enzymes that altered the very composition of the soil. It was efficient. It was predatory. It was alien. These were the first vanguard organisms, the feelers of the great beast, tasting the air, sampling the water, and preparing the world for consumption. The planet of Viridia Prime was being tested, its defenses probed, its soul weighed. And the verdict had been returned, it was ripe for the harvest. As the psychic silence deepened, the first physical predator arrived. It was a creature of perfect lethal design, a living weapon of infiltration and terror, known as a lictor. It did not arrive in a ship of steel and fire, but as a biological dart, a chameleonic pod that burned through the atmosphere and buried itself in the deepest, most inaccessible jungle on Viridia Prime's primary continent. It was a ghost, a ripple in the humid air, its skin shifting in color and texture, to become an indistinguishable part of the vegetation it moved through. It was not a beast driven by instinct, but an intelligence guided by the singular will of the hive mind. Its purpose was not to conquer, but to assess, to terrorize, and to mark the prey. It moved with a silence that was more profound than the absence of sound. It was an active nullity, its very biology designed to absorb light and sound. For days, it stalked the perimeter of the primary Imperial defense garrison Fortitude 5. It watched the patrols, memorized the guard rotations, and identified the nexus points of communication. Its multi-lensed eyes saw in spectra invisible to the human eye, tracing the heat signatures of power cables and the energy patterns of voxcasters. It was patient, methodical, and utterly without emotion. When it was time to act, it did so with an economy of violence that was breathtakingly brutal. Its first target was a watchtower on the northern fence. The two PDF guardsmen inside were complaining about the rations their Lazrafals slung carelessly over their shoulders. One moment they were bathed in the glow of their data slate. The next, a shadow detached itself from the wall behind them. There was no scream. A pair of great scything talons, sharp as monomolecular blades, punched through the flak armor and chests of both men simultaneously. Before their bodies could fall, the lictor's feeder tendrils, writhing appendages around its maw, whipped out and pierced the base of their skulls. It was not feeding for sustenance. It was feeding for information, siphoning the last terrified electrical impulses from their brains, tasting their knowledge of patrol routes, command structures, and security codes. It then turned its attention to the voxcaster, not smashing it, but surgically disemboweling it with its talons, ensuring no signal would ever be sent from it again. The entire act took less than 3 seconds. The hunter then melted back into the shadows, leaving only 2 strangely mutilated corpses and a profound silence. The next morning, Sergeant Alaric's patrol was sent to investigate the silent watchtower. He was a veteran of a dozen frontier skirmishes, a man who thought he had seen every kind of brutality the galaxy had to offer. He was wrong. Emperor's Mercy, one of his troopers, a young man named Pike, whispered, vomiting into a bush. The scene was clean, too clean. There was little blood. The men had been killed by precise, powerful upward thrusts. Their armor was pierced as if it were paper. But it was their heads that were the most disturbing. A small, neat hole had been bored into the back of each skull, and the contents seemed hollowed out. The expensive Master Vox unit was in pieces, its delicate inner workings shredded with a savage's precision. No blade I know makes a wound like that. Alaric muttered, his hand resting on his bolt pistol. And no rebel has the discipline for this. No tracks, no spent casings. It's like a ghost did this. Fear, cold and sharp, began to spread through the squad. This wasn't war. This was a hunt. They were the ones leaving tracks, their heat signatures visible, their scents polluting the air. They were the prey. All day they patrolled the perimeter, seeing nothing but jungle that seemed to watch them back, hearing nothing but a silence that felt heavy and expectant. Every shadow seemed to hold a pair of unseen eyes. The fear was worse than any firefight, a constant grinding pressure on the soul. They were being stalked, and they knew it. That night, hidden high in the canopy of a broadleaf tree, the lictor completed its primary mission. Its analysis of the planet's defenses was complete. It knew the weaknesses in their patrols, the frequencies of their communications, the fear in their hearts. It had tasted their flesh and mapped their genetics. Now it was time to send the signal. It raised its head to the sky, and from glands within its chitinous armor, it released a potent and complex stream of pheromones. It was an invisible scent, undetectable by any Imperial sensor. Yet to the hive mind, it was a beacon as bright as a star. It was a report, a lure, a dinner bell rung across the silent depths of space. The message was simple, encoded in a language of pure biology. Target world designated Viridia Prime. Defenses are minimal, scattered, and psychologically fragile. Biomass is rich, diverse, and ready for reclamation. The feast is prepared. The invitation is sent. Come and devour. The lictor's task was done. It had acted as the Judas goat, marking the world for absolute consumption. As the invisible cloud of chemicals drifted into the upper atmosphere, a cosmic signal to the approaching apocalypse, the creature lowered its head and once more became an inseparable part of the jungle, a waiting phantom of the doom to come. The lictor's pheromonic scream, silent to the inhabitants of Viridia Prime, was a deafening roar to the hive fleet lurking in the cold void beyond the system's edge. The invitation had been received. The time for subtlety was over. The feast was about to begin. The first sign of the coming apocalypse came not to the soldiers or the psychers, but to a lowly tech adept in the orbital watch station, Vox Angelis. His station was a lonely rock tasked with monitoring the system for pirate raiders and celestial debris. His console blared to life, flagging thousands of inbound objects from the system's dark side. Command, he reported, his voice bored and routine, registering a significant meteor shower. Trajectories indicate atmospheric entry over the primary continent in approximately 30 minutes. No threat to orbital structures. On the planet below, the governor was informed, and a planetary notice was issued advising citizens to enjoy the rare celestial light show. Amateur astronomers and curious citizens turned their eyes to the heavens, expecting a beautiful, harmless display. But on the Vox Angelis, the data was becoming increasingly strange. The objects were too uniform in size. Their descent vectors were too precisely aligned. Tech Adept Jax, the senior officer on duty, ran a spectroscopic analysis, and the blood drained from his face, leaving a pallor that was stark against his bionic eye. The readings came back not as rock or ice or metal, but as complex organic polymers and silicate chitin. "They're not rocks," he whispered, his voice trembling as he opened a priority channel to planetary command. "I repeat, these are not meteors. Their velocity is decreasing. They are using atmospheric friction as a braking mechanism. By the throne, they're steering." His final panicked message was cut off by a sudden, brutal impact, as one of the smaller objects, a gargoyle brood, swarmed the station, tearing it apart with living weapons and claws. On Viridia Prime, the Vox Angelis simply went silent. For the people on the surface, the awe quickly turned to terror. The meteors did not burn up into streaks of white and gold. They blazed through the sky as enormous incandescent spheres of flesh and armored hide, trailing plumes of superheated plasma. They were mycetic spores, biological drop pods, each one a living vessel carrying a payload of nightmares. They roared through the atmosphere, 1,000 screaming comets heralding the planet's doom. They began to strike the ground, not with the explosive force of an impactor, but with a sickening, wet crunch that shook the earth for miles around. They landed in the vast grain fields in the heart of dense jungles and on the outskirts of the sprawling hive cities. And they did not create craters. They split open. Like the galaxy's most obscene seed pods, their tough outer hides peeled back, disgorging their contents. From each smoking, pulsating husk poured a living tide of creatures. A chittering, screeching wave of hormagaunts, 6-limbed killing machines, running on 4 legs with 2 great scything talons, held high, surged forth with impossible speed. They were a sea of claws, a river of teeth moving with a singular, terrifying purpose. Alongside them scuttled countless termagants, smaller bipedal organisms armed with symbiotic weapons that spat flesh-eating beetles or corrosive acid. From a single spore came hundreds of these monstrosities, and thousands of spores were striking the planet every minute. In Hive Primus, the planetary capital, the defense sirens began their deafening shriek, a sound no living citizen had ever heard outside of drills. The sky, once a brilliant blue, was turning a mottled, sickly brown, not from clouds but from the sheer overwhelming number of descending spores and the vast swarms of leathery-winged gargoyles that now filled the air. The spectacle was one of sublime, apocalyptic horror. Panic erupted in the streets. Citizens who had been gazing at the sky in wonder were now trampled in a desperate stampede for shelter. The first sporadic pops of lasgun fire echoed from the hive walls as the hopelessly outnumbered PDF troopers opened fire on the approaching tide. It was like throwing stones into a tidal wave. The first scream of the city was a collective unified cry of terror as the first wave of hormagaunts, a carpet of chittering, leaping death, crashed against the outer hab blocks. The hunt was over. The invasion had begun. The Great Devourer had arrived, and its hunger would now be fed. The planetary defense plan for Viridia Prime was a document written in steel and faith, a testament to standard Imperial military doctrine. In the face of the Xenos swarm pouring from the mycetic spores, the Viridian 34th Planetary Defense Force and elements of the Cadian 122nd Shock Troops, who were garrisoned on the world after a previous campaign, enacted this plan. They formed a wall. It was a beautiful and terrible thing, a kilometer-long line of trenches, razor wire and plasteel barricades. Heavy bolter nests were dug in at 50-meter intervals, their overlapping fields of fire creating a perfect kill zone. Behind them, the engines of Leman Russ battle tanks rumbled, their cannons aimed at the seething horizon. A basilisk artillery battery miles to the rear prepared to rain explosive death upon the enemy. Commissars walked the line, their voices sharp and clear over the din, reminding the men of their duty, their faith, and the cost of failure. They had trained for this. They were the Emperor's fury made manifest. They were prepared for war. But this was not war. This was extinction. The first thing they experienced was the sound. It was not the guttural roar of orcs or the battle cries of chaos cultists. It was a high-pitched, chittering shriek, a sound made by millions of throats, and the clicking of trillions of chitinous legs on packed earth. It was the sound of a species that communicated only through the imperatives of the hunt and the kill. Then they saw it. The horizon ceased to be a line between earth and sky, and became a moving, undulating wall of flesh and claw. The Hormagaunt swarm advanced not in disciplined ranks but as a single living tsunami, a boundless ocean of scythe-limbed monsters that stretched from one edge of sight to the other. There was no flank to turn, no weak point to exploit. There was only the tide. First-rank fire at will. The order given by a captain whose voice was steady despite the tremor in his hands was almost lost in the shriek. 1,000 lasguns opened up, stitching the air with incandescent red bolts. The heavy bolters joined in their deep percussive roar like the hammering of a giant's fist. The battle cannons of the Leman Russ tanks spat fire, their shells detonating in the front ranks of the swarm, blasting hundreds of the creatures into sprays of purple ichor and shattered chitin. For a glorious fleeting moment, the Imperial line held. The sheer volume of fire was staggering, and the first few waves of Hormagaunts were annihilated, their bodies forming a rampart of their own dead. But the tide did not slow. It did not falter. It did not even seem to notice its losses. More and more creatures swarmed forward, running over the corpses of their fallen brethren, their shrieks never ceasing, their pace never slackening. The swarm hit the razor wire. The sharpened metal designed to halt entire infantry charges was overwhelmed in seconds. The front ranks were impaled and shredded, but their sheer mass and momentum tore the barricades from their moorings. They filled the trenches not by climbing down, but by simply falling and creating a living bridge of bodies for the next wave to cross. The disciplined lines of the Imperial Guard dissolved into 1,000 desperate individual struggles for survival. Laser fire became frantic and unaimed. Men screamed as the creatures, leaping with uncanny speed, descended into the trenches among them. The air was filled with the wet crunch of chitinous claws, punching through flak armor, the tearing of flesh, and the high-pitched screams of dying men. As the melee raged in the trenches, a new horror began. From behind the wave of hormagaunts came the termagants, a walking artillery line of smaller bipedal beasts. They raised their symbiotic weapons, and the sky darkened with a storm of biological ammunition. It was a rain of living death. Globs of sizzling acid fired from acid maws splattered across guardsmen and fortifications, dissolving flesh and metal with equal ease. Torrents of living, writhing worms, each with its own set of razor-sharp teeth, were spewed from devourers, shredding men to ribbons in their trenches. Worst of all were the flesh borers, which fired beetles that struck with the force of a bullet, then burrowed furiously into the victim's body, eating their way through organs with ravenous speed. Soldiers who were not torn apart by the hormagaunts were being eaten alive from the inside out, or melted into bubbling slurry. Courage became a footnote in a history of pain. A guardsman would stand his ground, bayoneting one creature only to be torn apart by 3 more from the side. A commissar executing a fleeing trooper for cowardice was himself swarmed and pulled down, his defiant shouts silenced by a dozen snapping jaws. The proud Lehman Russ tanks were blinded as hundreds of gaunts swarmed over their hulls, clawing at vision slits and jamming their turrets with their own bodies. The morale of the Viridian 34th did not just break, it evaporated. The carefully constructed wall of steel and faith was being washed away by a sea of claws. The order to fire at will was replaced by a single, desperate, wordless, understanding flee. The retreat began, a chaotic, terrified scramble over the bodies of the fallen as the chittering, screeching wave of chitin flowed over the abandoned trenches, leaving nothing behind but death, and continuing its inexorable advance. In the chaos of the rout, there were still pockets of defiance. The Imperial Guard is not so easily broken, and its steel heart is the Lehman Russ battle tank. One such tank, the Emperor's Wrath, commanded by a grizzled sergeant named Krell, had become a mobile fortress. It reversed slowly, its hull-mounted heavy bolter, spewing a constant stream of death into the tide of hormagaunts, while its main battle cannon fired shell after shell, each blast creating a momentary clearing in the living sea. For a time, it seemed that steel could still triumph over flesh. The tank was an anchor in the storm, a symbol of Imperial might. And the hive mind, with its cold, calculating intelligence, could not permit such a symbol to endure. The ground began to tremble with a rhythm deeper and more powerful than the tank's treads. A guttural roar, a sound of pure, primal rage, cut through the chittering of the smaller beasts. The gaunts parted, scurrying away from a path being cleared for something vast. It was a carnifex, a living battering ram, a mountain of muscle and hyperdense bone armor. It charged forward on 4 thick legs, its head protected by a shield of solid chitin. In place of arms, it wielded 2 pairs of enormous scything talons, each the size of a man. Sergeant Krell roared an order. "Target the big one, fire." The battle cannon boomed, and the high-explosive shell struck the carnifex square in the chest. The explosion would have vaporized a squad of men, but the beast merely staggered. A few plates of its armor cracked and roared again, its rage now focused entirely on the tank. It covered the remaining distance in a few thunderous strides and crashed into the Emperor's Wrath with the force of a freight train. The sound was of screaming, groaning metal. The tank, weighing over 60 tons, was shoved backwards, its treads digging trenches in the soil. Before the crew could react, the carnifex brought its talons down. They didn't just scratch the armor, they pierced it. The monstrous blades punched through the thick plasteel and ceramite of the turret as if it were tin. The crew's screams over the internal vox were cut short as the talons scythed through the compartment, turning men and machinery into a mangled ruin. With another roar, the Carnifex tore the entire turret from the tank's chassis and threw it aside, leaving the burning hull as a monument to the futility of steel against the hive mind's living siege engines. Miles away at what was once the command bastion for the entire defensive line, the horror took on a different form. The bunker was sealed, its thick ferrocrete walls withstanding the tide of smaller creatures. Inside, officers desperately tried to coordinate a new defensive line, believing their fortification was inviolable. They were wrong. The tremors started subtly, a vibration in the floor plates. Then the walls cracked. Dust rained from the ceiling. A Vox officer screamed as his console exploded in a shower of sparks. Suddenly, the entire central floor of the bastion buckled and then burst upwards in a cataclysm of shattered rock and twisted metal. From the hole it created, a Trigon Prime erupted. A serpentine behemoth, its body a nightmare of armored plates and razor-sharp spines. It towered over the men inside the confined space. Its 6 great talons tore through the command staff, while its long, pincer-tipped tail decapitated men on the upper gantries. It unleashed a pulse of bioelectric energy, a crackling wave of lightning that fried every electronic system in the bunker and cooked soldiers alive in their armor. The bastion had not been breached from the outside. It had been disemboweled from within. The hive mind did not need to knock on the door when it could simply tear down the entire house from beneath the foundations. All across the battlefield, the specialized bioforms of the Tyranid swarm were fulfilling their roles. From the rear, great lumbering beasts called exocrines planted themselves, their bodies glowing with bioplasma, before they unleashed a cannonade of raw energy that vaporized entire squads and turned bunkers to slag. Bloated, hunched creatures, the biovores heaved and convulsed, lobbing biological mines into the retreating Imperial lines. These spore mines were living creatures themselves, drifting silently down from the sky until they detected prey, at which point they would detonate in a shower of acid shrapnel and smaller organisms that burrowed into the survivors. The sky, already thick with gargoyles, became a hunting ground as they swooped down to attack exposed officers, blind vehicle sensors with acidic spittle, and drop living bombs onto concentrations of troops. Every element of Imperial warfare, infantry, armor, fortification, command, and control had been met with a tailored, living, and utterly terrifying counter. This was not a mindless swarm. It was a perfectly orchestrated ecosystem of war. As the Hive fleet fully translated from the void into real space, descending into high orbit over the doomed world of Viridia Prime, the psychic pressure that had been a creeping dread became a cataclysmic event. The shadow in the warp fell upon the planet in its totality. It was not a shadow of darkness, but a shadow of utter soul-crushing nullity. It was the psychic manifestation of a trillion minds, all focused on a singular predatory purpose, and this monolithic consciousness simply snuffed out the chaotic energies of the Imperium. For the astropathic choir, it was the apocalypse. The gentle hum of the Astronomicon, the golden psychic lighthouse that guided humanity through the stars, was extinguished as if it were a candle in a hurricane. The astropaths, their minds unprotected and fully open to the warp, were the first to be consumed. In their sanctum, they began to scream. It was a sound no human throat should make, a harmony of pure agony. Their minds, which had once touched the edges of the galaxy, were now trapped in a psychic echo chamber with the Great Devourer. They did not just sense its hunger. They felt it. They experienced the conceptual weight of 1 billion devoured worlds, 1 billion silenced civilizations. Blood poured from their eyes, ears, and noses as the sheer pressure ruptured every vessel in their skulls. Some simply collapsed, their brains cooked into inert matter. Others suffered a far worse fate. Their minds shattered, they became screaming, unwilling gateways. For fractions of a second, the raw, unfiltered madness of the warp tore through their bodies, manifesting as flashes of impossible color and whispers of demonic voices, before the crushing weight of the shadow slammed the doors shut again. Viridia Prime was now an island completely severed from the Imperium. No prayers would reach the Emperor. No distress calls would reach his fleets. No hope would arrive. They were utterly and completely alone. This psychic oppression was not limited to the gifted. Every human soul felt it. It was a constant grinding weight on the spirit, a background noise of dread that frayed nerves and turned courage into a fleeting memory. For Colonel Varus of the Cadian 122nd, a man whose will was forged in the fires of a dozen campaigns, it was a new and terrifying form of warfare. As he tried to rally the broken remnants of his command, he felt the constant chilling sensation of being watched. It was not the gaze of a physical predator, but the cold, analytical scrutiny of a vast and ancient intellect. It felt like an insect being observed under a magnifying glass by a god. The hive mind's presence was a palpable force on the battlefield, an invisible poison that leached the strength from a soldier's heart. This aura of despair was focused and amplified into a true weapon by the synaptic linchpins of the swarm. On a ridge overlooking the largest pocket of Imperial resistance, a hive tyrant appeared. It was a towering monster of claws and chitin, wielding a bone sword that hummed with psychic energy and a lash whip that cracked like thunder. But its most terrifying weapon was its mind. As it fixed its gaze upon the Imperial lines, the ambient dread coalescing around it into a tangible wave of pure terror. Men who had stood firm against charging carnifexes now froze in place, their limbs refusing to obey them. Veterans who had charged orc warbands with nothing but a bayonet now dropped their laser guns and curled into a ball, weeping. Their fear was not their own. It was being injected directly into their souls, a psychic command to despair. The hive tyrant did not need to kill every soldier. It simply had to command them to die, and their own minds would obey. And then came the living artillery of the mind. Floating serenely over the carnage, their atrophied bodies little more than conveyance for their one monstrously oversized organ, were the zoanthropes. Their exposed, pulsating brains glowed with an eerie purple light crackling with the raw power of the warp. A squad of guardsmen huddled behind the wreck of a chimera aimed their weapons at one of the floating horrors. Before they could fire, the zoanthrope's head tilted. The air grew thick, smelling of ozone. There was no sound, no explosion, only a silent flash of violet energy. A lance of pure warp power struck the chimera. The tank and the men behind it did not explode. They were unmade. Metal flesh and faith were dissolved into their constituent atoms and scattered to the wind, leaving only a scorched silhouette on the ground. It was a death so absolute it denied the soul even the dignity of a corpse. Moving in their wake were the neurothropes, their brain crests even larger, their psychic presence a vampiric drain on the very essence of life. One drifted over a makeshift aid station where wounded men screamed in agony. The neurothrope did nothing. It simply hovered. But as it did, the men began to change. Their screams of pain became shrieks of a different, more profound horror. They writhed as their life force, their spirit, their will to live, was drawn from their bodies in shimmering ethereal tendrils flowing from their flesh into the creature's pulsing brain. They aged decades in seconds, their bodies becoming desiccated, hollow-eyed husks. The neurothrope fed not on their blood or flesh, but on their souls, growing stronger with every spirit it consumed. The Tyranid invasion was not just a physical conquest. It was a psychic, scouring an assault that sought to annihilate humanity on every plane of its existence. The war for Viridia Prime was over. What followed was not an occupation, but a digestion. For the handful of survivors hiding in the deepest ruins and the most inaccessible caves, the world they knew began to vanish, replaced by a biological nightmare that grew and consumed with horrifying speed. The hive mind was no longer fighting a war. It was terraforming in reverse, systematically deconstructing a living world into a raw, digestible slurry. The first thing to change was the sky. On the horizon where the main swarms had concentrated, vast and grotesque structures began to grow. They were spore chimneys, colossal fleshy towers that pulsed with a sickening rhythmic beat, like the organs of some impossibly large beast. They clawed their way thousands of feet into the sky, and from their gaping maws they began to vent a continuous thick plume of microscopic spores into the upper atmosphere. The brilliant blue sky of Viridia Prime was suffocated. It turned a murky, bruised purple, then a sickly, feverish red. The sun became a dim, hazy smear, its light struggling to pierce the ever-thickening biological fog. The air itself became an enemy. It grew thick and heavy, tasting of rot and alien chemicals. A constant rasping cough became the new language of the survivors as the alien spores invaded their lungs, their very bodies, becoming unwilling hosts to the new ecosystem. The world was being sealed in a tomb of its own atmosphere. Next, the ground itself began to transform. The endless golden fields that had given the agri-world its name withered and died in a matter of hours, turning a brittle, deathly black. From this blighted soil, a new and predatory ecosystem erupted. The native flora was choked out by aggressive Tyranid vegetation. Great pulsating polyps burst from the ground, spraying digestive enzymes that broke down the rock and soil around them. Thick, thorny vines covered in a shimmering slime snaked across the landscape, strangling everything in their path. And piercing through it all were the capillary towers. They were the most terrifying structures of all, semi-translucent spires of a keratin-like substance driven deep into the planet's crust, like colossal hypodermic needles. They grew with unnatural speed, hundreds of feet tall, their purpose terrifyingly clear. They were straws designed to drink the lifeblood of the planet. Through their translucent walls, one could see a thick, nutrient-rich slurry being pumped upwards, drawn from the deepest soil layers and subterranean water tables. Viridia Prime was being bled dry, and then came the Rippers. After the main battle swarms had moved on, annihilating the last pockets of organized resistance, a new kind of tide advanced. It was not a wave of towering monsters, but a chittering, writhing carpet of small, grub-like creatures. Each was little more than a set of powerful jaws attached to a muscular, serpentine body. Individually, they were insignificant. Collectively, they were the planet's digestive system. They swarmed over the battlefields, a single, undulating mass of hunger. They consumed everything. They swarmed over the corpses of the fallen Imperial guardsmen, stripping them to bone in minutes. They devoured the bodies of their own fallen Tyranid brethren, for the hive mind wastes nothing. They chewed through the dying native vegetation and the new alien flora alike. They consumed the topsoil, grinding it down with their powerful jaws and excreting it as a nutrient-rich paste. The planet's water systems suffered a similar fate. The great rivers that irrigated the fields turned a sluggish, murky gray, choked with a ravenous single-celled Tyranid algae that consumed all oxygen and starved all native life. The oceans themselves began to cloud over, the first sign that their deepest trenches were being colonized, their geothermal vents becoming incubators for the next wave of horrors. For the survivors, every aspect of their world had become alien and hostile. The air was poison, the ground was a predatory garden, and the dead were simply the first course of a planetary meal. The shrieking of the hormagaunts had been replaced by a new sound, a constant wet, grinding, chewing noise that echoed across the ruined plains. It was the sound of a world being eaten alive from the crust to the core. In the ruins of Hive Primus, amidst the grotesque alien landscape that was once a thriving city, a final futile gesture of defiance was being made. Less than 20 souls, a mix of Cadian shock troopers, local PDF remnants, and a handful of hardened civilians, had made their last bastion in the cavernous shell of the Cathedral of the Emperor Ascendant. The grand stained glass windows depicting imperial saints were now shattered, gaping wounds that showed a sickly red sky. The marble floors were slick with alien slime, and the great golden aquila above the altar was draped in pulsating violet-hued vines. All communications were dead. Their voxcasters hissed only static, a sound that was somehow lonelier than silence. Hope was a resource they had exhausted days ago. Now, all that remained was duty, and the grim determination to die standing. Sergeant Boris of the Cadian 122nd, a man whose face was a roadmap of scars, took the final inventory. 3 dozen lasgun charge packs, 5 crack grenades, and a single jealously guarded flamer canister. Barely enough for a decent firefight, let alone a siege. They were not fighting for victory. They were not fighting to be rescued. They were fighting for the principle that Cadian blood does not run at fights. They were fighting so that the last human act on this dead world would not be a scream of terror, but a roar of defiance. They huddled behind makeshift barricades of broken pews and shattered statues, the silence outside stretching their nerves to the breaking point. The endless tide of gaunts had passed them by, but they knew they had not been forgotten. The attack, when it came, was not a mindless wave. The hive mind was no longer wasting biomass on such an insignificant pocket of resistance. Instead, it sent its specialists. The hunt began with a tremor in the cathedral floor. 3 serpentine creatures with bladed arms and chitinous crests. Raveners burst up through the stone flags, their tunneling claws shattering the ancient marble. They shrieked and fell upon the defenders, sowing chaos and confusion in their ranks. This was a feint, a distraction. As the survivors' fire was drawn to the burrowing horrors, the true threat made its entrance through the cathedral's main doors. 3 Tyranid warriors, the synapse-linked lieutenants of the swarm, stalked into the holy sanctum. They were far larger and more intelligent than the common gaunt, their 4 arms wielding a combination of living weaponry bonezords that dripped with venom and devourer cannons that writhed with hungry ammunition. They moved with a chilling tactical precision, directing the Ravener's attack and pointing out targets. Flanking them was the ultimate expression of biological defense, a tyrant guard. The creature was a walking wall of impenetrable chitin, its body hunched behind 2 enormous shield-like claws. It had no eyes, for it saw through the psychic link of the hive mind. Its sole purpose was to act as a living shield and a battering ram. The hive mind had assessed the survivor's position and sent the perfect tools to dismantle it. For Cadia, for the Emperor. Sergeant Boris roared, his voice cutting through the fear. It was the signal. The last stand began. Lasfire, disciplined and controlled, stitched across the advancing creatures. The Raveners shrieked as bolts burned into their flesh, but the warriors were protected by the Tyrant Guard, which absorbed the volley on its armored carapace with no effect. The flamer roared to life, bathing one of the Raveners in ignited promethium, turning it into a screaming, thrashing torch. But it was not enough. The Tyrant Guard reached the barricade and smashed it aside with contemptuous ease. One of the warriors leapt over the wreckage, its bonezords a blur, cutting 2 PDF troopers in half before they could even scream. A civilian, a former Factorum worker with fury in her eyes, leveled a scavenged las pistol and blasted the creature in the face, buying a few precious seconds before she was impaled by its partner. Sergeant Boris met the lead warrior's charge, his chainsword roaring to life. Steel met alien bone in a shower of sparks. It was a hero's duel that lasted only moments. The creature was faster, stronger, and Boris was ultimately thrown back. His armor cracked and his body broken. He lay against the steps of the desecrated altar, his lifeblood pooling on the marble. As his vision faded, he offered one last silent prayer to the God Emperor. He received no answer. The last thing he saw was the chittering maw of a Tyranid warrior descending upon him. One by one, the last lights of defiance were snuffed out. The final grenade was thrown. The last defiant curse was shouted. Then a profound silence fell over the cathedral of the Emperor Ascendant, broken only by the wet, tearing sounds of the victors feasting on the vanquished. The battle for Viridia Prime was truly over. With the last flicker of defiance snuffed out, the hive mind initiated the final stage of its harvest. The face of Viridia Prime, already a grotesque parody of a living world, was transformed once more. The vast swarms of warrior organisms their purpose served either fell dormant or were herded into hibernation pits by synaptic creatures. A new set of bioforms emerged to take their place. These were not warriors but processors, huge beetle-like harvester beasts moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm began to methodically scour the landscape. They were the undertakers of a dead world. With an unnerving lack of ceremony, they began to collect the dead. They used massive pincer-like mandibles and delicate grasping tendrils to pick up every scrap of organic matter. The corpse of the heroic Sergeant Boris, his chainsword still clutched in his hand, was lifted with the same indifferent efficiency as the carcass of the Tyranid warrior that had killed him. The bodies of Cadian troopers were tossed into throbbing sacks alongside the remains of Hormagaunts raveners and the native fauna of the planet. To the hive mind, there was no distinction. There was no hero, no monster, no victim, no victor. There was only biomass, a resource to be collected and reabsorbed. This grim harvest was carried to designated sites, vast natural valleys or craters, blasted by the initial spore impacts, which had now been lined with a thick, pulsating, semi-permeable membrane. These were the reclamation pools. The pools themselves were a vision of hell rendered through the lens of biology. They were lakes of churning, steaming, primordial ooze acres wide and hundreds of feet deep. The harvester beasts would arrive at the precipice and simply empty their contents, sending a cascade of bodies tumbling into the bubbling slurry below. The moment a corpse touched the surface, the process began. The liquid was not water but a hyper-concentrated digestive acid, a biological catalyst of incredible power. Flesh dissolved in moments, sloughing from bone in thick, greasy sheets. Flak armor, plasteel, and even the super-dense chitin of Tyranid carapaces were broken down, their molecular bonds unwritten by the voracious enzymes. The sight was one of utter deconstruction. A million individual tragedies, a billion years of unique planetary evolution, all were rendered down into a uniform, undifferentiated soup. The churning liquid was a maelstrom of dissolving shapes, a human skull sinking beside the scythed talon of a Hormagaunt, both turning to liquid before they could reach the bottom. The pools steamed with foul, chemical-rich vapors, and the sound was a constant wet sizzle, the sound of a world being rendered into its most basic components. This was the ultimate expression of the Tyranid purpose to erase all complexity, all history, all identity, and reduce the galaxy to a single homogeneous digestible paste. This was the genetic soup from which new nightmares would be born, and as the pools filled, the great capillary towers began their final terrible work. Thick, vein-like conduits as wide as roadways snaked from the base of the towers and plunged into the reclamation pools. With a deep, groaning hum that vibrated through the planet's crust, they began to draw the genetic slurry upwards. The thick, nutrient-rich fluid could be seen flowing through the tower's translucent walls, a dark tide rising towards the waiting bioships in the void. Other towers, their roots sunk deep into the planet's dying oceans, began to pump trillions of gallons of water, stripping it of minerals and hydrogen, sending a torrent of raw elements into orbit. The tallest towers, their spires scraping the edge of space, began to inhale the atmosphere itself. The sickly red air grew thin, the pressure dropping as nitrogen, oxygen, and every other gas was siphoned away. The planet was being drunk dry. Its flesh, its blood, and now its very breath were being drawn up into the belly of the great devourer that waited patiently among the stars. When the reclamation pools were finally drained and the last gasp of atmosphere had been siphoned from the stratosphere, the great biological machines of the Tyranids fell silent. The colossal capillary towers, their purpose fulfilled, withered with startling speed. They crumbled under their own weight, their once translucent hides turning gray and brittle, collapsing into mountains of fine, sterile dust. The harvester beasts and the ripper swarms, their work complete, crawled into vast, self-sealing digestion pits to be broken down and reabsorbed by the very ground they had scoured. The hive mind wastes nothing, not even its own instruments. In the void above, the hive fleet began to stir. The bioships, once lean and predatory, were now swollen and engorged, their membranous hulls glowing with the stored energy of a billion lives. The umbilical tendrils that had connected them to the capillary towers detached and retracted into their fleshy underbellies. There was no thunder of engines, no flash of plasma drives, no tear in reality to mark a jump to the warp. With a silent, unified impulse, the entire fleet began to move. It was the movement of a natural organism, a great celestial leviathan turning in the currents of space. It moved away from the pale, dead sun of the Viridian system, its myriad eyes already fixed upon the next distant star, the next source of warmth, the next meal. It left behind no monuments, no victory flags, no signs of its passage, save for the one it had created. It left behind a dead rock. Viridia Prime, once a vibrant agri-world, was now a perfect sphere of gray dust and scoured stone. Its atmosphere was gone, leaving its surface exposed to the hard vacuum and the unfiltered radiation of its sun. Its oceans were gone, leaving behind vast, salt-encrusted basins that cracked and split under the relentless solar glare. Its cities were gone, their soaring spires and deep foundations eroded and eaten away, until they were little more than faint, geometric scars on the landscape. There were no bones, no ruins, no relics. Everything that had ever lived, ever been built, ever existed on the planet had been broken down, consumed and carried away. It was a world utterly and completely erased, a testament to an appetite so absolute that it consumed even the memory of its meal. 150 years later, the Imperial explorator vessel Stellarchus Duty entered the Viridian system on a routine charting mission. Its powerful auger arrays swept the third planet, gathering data and comparing it to archives that were centuries out of date. The cogitator screens flickered with cold, emotionless data. No atmosphere, no liquid hydrosphere, no detectable biological or energy signatures. Trace geological evidence of prior civilization now extinct. The ship's master, a tech priest more concerned with fuel consumption than ancient history, approved the final log entry. Log entry 734. System designation Viridia. Planet the 3, Viridia Prime. Classification updated dead world. Subclassification Tyranids scoured. All harvestable resources depleted. No strategic value remains. Charting complete. Proceeding to next survey point. With that brief, bureaucratic epitaph, the Stellarchus Duty turned and engaged its warp drives, leaving the silent, empty system behind. The life and death of a world, the struggle and sacrifice of billions, was reduced to a single, sterile line item in the vast, uncaring ledger of the Imperium. And so the great silence returns to the place that was once Viridia Prime. A cycle as natural and as pitiless as the death of a star is complete. What you have witnessed is the anatomy of a hunt on a galactic scale, a biological imperative executed with the flawless, unthinking efficiency of a force of nature. It is a story that has played out 1,000,000 times before, and one that will be repeated on 1,000,000 worlds yet to come. Recall the stages. It began not with a bang, but with an absence. A hollowing out of the spiritual realm, a creeping silence that choked the prayers of psychers and planted the first seeds of dread. It was the shadow falling long and cold before the predator's arrival. Then came the hunt, a phase of exquisite, terrifying precision. A lone phantom in the dark, a ghost of chitin and claw, stalked the defenders, learning their fears, tasting their strengths, and marking the planet as ripe for the slaughter. It was the calm, patient stalking of the prey. Then the sky fell. The true nature of the invasion was revealed in a storm of living drop pods, a reign of biological devastation that seeded the world with the instruments of its own demise. The hunt was over. The culling began. A tide of living blades, a sea of scythes and claws, crashed against the fragile walls of steel and faith. It was a war against a foe that could not be reasoned with, could not be intimidated, and could not be stopped for its numbers, whereas the grains of sand on an infinite shore. When the last defiant roar was silenced, the true purpose was revealed. The living siege engines, the psychic horrors, the waves of endless bodies, they were not just instruments of war, but the tools of a butcher designed to break down the prey for easier consumption. The planet itself became the meal. Its skies were poisoned, its soil was rewritten, its very substance was methodically broken down by a new and ravenous ecosystem. The final stage was one of pure industrial consumption. The dead, the living, the very rocks and oceans were rendered down in great steaming vats of acid reduced to a single homogeneous genetic soup. The great straws drank deep, draining the world of its flesh, its blood and its breath, leaving behind the clean, sterile bones of a dead world. Do not make the mistake of ascribing malice to this process. Do not grant the hive mind the dignity of hatred. To hate is to acknowledge, to form a relationship, however twisted. You do not hate the grain you harvest. You do not feel anger towards the water you drink. The hive mind did not hate the people of Viridia Prime. It did not know them. They were a momentary flicker of complexity in a universe that it seeks to simplify. Their struggles, their heroism, their love, their faith. These were brief, meaningless chemical reactions in a meal that was on a cosmic scale, consumed in an instant. Look now and see the greater truth. Pull your gaze away from the single scoured rock of Viridia Prime and look out upon the grandeur of the galaxy. See the Milky Way, a swirl of 100 billion stars, and see the shadows that move between them. See the colossal tendril of Hive Fleet Behemoth, a blunt instrument of brute force crashing against the eastern fringe. See the insidious scattered fleets of Kraken rising from the galactic core, 1,000 hunting packs working in concert. And see the greatest shadow of all, Leviathan, a predator of unimaginable scale, rising not from the edge but from below the galactic plane, its jaws opening to consume the galaxy from its very foundations. For every world like Viridia Prime that is consumed, 1,000 more lie in the path of the advance. On each one, civilizations rise and fall ignorant of the silence that is creeping into their skies. On each one, heroes will be born, and they will die fighting tides of flesh they cannot comprehend. The story of what happens when the Tyranids hunt you is not the story of a single world. It is the story of the galaxy itself. It is the story of a silent cosmic ocean filled with countless hungry leviathans. The great devourer moves on, and it is always, always hungry.